Welcome to the Human Rights Initiative lecture series. My name is Kiyoteru Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the Sociology department here and program director for the Human Rights Initiative. Can you hear me well? Is it on? Okay. I have a couple of announcements to make before introducing our speaker today. There'll be a talk at Ford School, part of the Ford Security Seminar series, by Carrie Booth Walling, entitled Human Rights Norms, State Sovereignty, and Humanitarian Intervention. It takes place on Monday, October 28th at 11:30 a.m. 3240 Weil Hall is where it's going to take place. This is the second Human Rights Initiative lecture for this semester, and the third one is coming up on November 4th at 4 p.m. Elza Stamatopoulos will give a talk entitled The Indigenous Emergency. Okay, and we had the first talk on first Human Rights Initiative lecture a few weeks ago, and if you missed it, you can go to YouTube, search for Human Rights Initiative, Emily Hafner Burton, and you can find it. I took a look at it, and I realized that I talked for more than 5 minutes doing the introduction, so I'm going to try to be brief today. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ryan Goodman, who is Anne and Joel Ehrenkranz Professor of Law at New York University School of Law. If you study international law, if you study especially international human rights law, you must have heard of his name and must have written his work. He's a really, really very prominent figure in the field. He earned his law degree at Yale School, and he also has a PhD in sociology, so he's very friendly to sociological thinking, which I really appreciate. He earned his tenure at Harvard University Law School, and now he teaches at NYU. And he has a mesmerizing publication record. Just in the past couple years, he has co-authored or co-edited 4 books. And the new book, the latest book is coming out, or just come out, right? Socializing States, and the talk today is based on that book. And he also has a prominent, potent presence in the web space, blogosphere and Twitter sphere, is that a word? And he co-edits this blog, justsecurity.org is the site for that, justsecurity.org. So if you want to be up to date on what's going on in the world of security and human rights and international law, that's a good place to check out regularly. Okay. So before I get too verbose, I'm going to stop here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ryan Goodman.
So thanks very much for that introduction and for the invitation to be with you all today. And what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about the book that recently came out, and then not just deal with that, but also deal with the next part of my research that comes off of that book. And the book project is a culmination of years of work with a co-author and a colleague of mine, Derek Jenks. And the basic idea of the book is how do you best design human rights institutions in light of the social forces that drive state behavior. And by social forces, we mean the mechanisms or processes by which one actor or institution tries to change the behavior of another actor. And the book identifies 3 different mechanisms by which one actor would change another actor's beliefs or behavioral practices. One is material inducement, and I'll be able to just kind of walk down this one table in a moment. The other one is persuasion, and then the third is one that we think is not as being readily identified in the extant literature, which is acculturation. And the book takes up this issue along 2 axes. The first is an issue area of human rights. The idea here is that our prior work, Derek and mine, had concentrated on civil and political rights. The book also expands the focus to include economic and social rights, right to housing, right to health, and right to food and the like. The idea is that it's to be comprehensive, and the other idea is that social and economic rights are often thought of as the harder case to prove that states will actually be willing to change their behavior according to global pressures or global norms. And in many respects, that states would be willing to change their behavior because it's law. Social and economic rights are usually thought of as the harder or the hardest case to prove that there's any optimism along that front. The second domain of the book, or the second axis, is the first one is human rights as the substance, and the second one is a structural domain, where we're looking basically at international regimes. By that I mean, how do you better build a mousetrap in a certain sense to trap, one might even say, autocratic states within the international system that will promote rights over time. But the thought is that we, in our previous work, Derek and I focused primarily on human rights treaties, and in the book we focus on other organizations, like the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. And what I'll get to in my opening remarks, opening lecture, are places in which you would think about things like what should be the membership rules of international organizations. Do you want all states of the world to join the organization, or would you restrict the organization only to those states that are already performing according to a certain level of human rights? And Emily Hafner-Burton was the prior speaker in this series, and I take up her work as a kind of a challenge by thinking that she's making an argument for redistributing resources away from autocratic, highly repressive states because she thinks it doesn't work there, and instead focusing on the states where you can really change behavior. My argument, as you'll see when it unfolds, is that using the mechanism of acculturation and the structure of international organizations that I identify, I think there's much greater room for optimism. I think there are better or equally plausible theoretical explanations for why she doesn't see change. Okay, so that's basically the idea. The idea of the book is, how do you build better institutions in light of what we have as available social scientific information as to what changes state actor behavior. The book is organized with a theory in mind, or a thought in mind, I should say, not a theory in mind, a thought in mind of four overarching points. The first point is that the existing international legal scholarship is thin in its conception of the microprocesses of state action. That in an international law, if you pick up the pages of a law journal, it's often talking about whether international norms affect state behavior, not how international norms affect state behavior, which is pitched at a very high level of abstraction. And it's by my kind of reaching out into what social scientists have been writing about and empirical work in that area, and Professor Tsutsui is one of the leaders in that area, and that in fact has been very influential in terms of my thinking, but the ways in which international norms operate on states by making certain kinds of legal principles legitimate. And the ways in which those operate by changing state behavior because you change the environment, the cultural environment around which states participate with other states in making new norms. So this also asks questions like, when we say persuasion, what do we mean by persuasion? What would a social psychologist tell you are the inner elements of being able to persuade another actor of a certain belief as being the normatively appropriate belief, or a certain practice as being the proper practice? And how does persuasion, which often works through certain kinds of pressures, differ from material pressures that you might place on an individual in order to change their beliefs or their practices? So it's trying to really drill down into the micro-processes of human belief, human behavior, and then drill back up in terms of humans as within state organizations, nation states, and governments. So the first point is that international legal scholarship has not really approached those kinds of questions. It's primarily been focused on whether or not international law is law and international law matters, but not how it matters and under what conditions, which are more kind of a policymaker and a social scientific way to approach those kinds of questions. The second point of the book and the project of the research that I've been working on is to say that this under-specification has led to the foregrounding of two mechanisms. So you could pick up books by leading legal scholars and law review articles by leading legal scholars, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Harold Coe, Abe, and Tony Chase, in a sense. That book as well is almost a little bit more interdisciplinary. But those books, I think, emphasize two mechanisms, material power, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and persuasion, and either conflate or overlook acculturation as a distinct third mechanism. Okay, and the third point of the book, which takes my project into a very different direction, is not just to look at the mechanisms, but to also look at the social structure. So by that, what I mean is to look at the ways in which states actually act like nodes within a social network. And part of the thought here is that what I want to bring to the table are not only the ways in which some of the acculturation scholarship I'll talk a little bit about thinks about the way in which a state has a relationship to the international community, but to actually think of the international community as a network of states, and how the mechanism of acculturation, which is kind of a cultural form of normativity, operates within social networks. So to think of a very different kind of social structure, networks, and to think of the mechanism as these three mechanisms, with acculturation as being a primary important one. The fourth point I've already kind of prefaced, which is that the orientation of the book is to try to yield policy-making recommendations, so that at the end of the book, the thought is, and at the end of this kind of research project, you would be able to make decisions based on the available evidence to the best of one's ability as to how precisely you would want legal norms to be drafted, membership rules for including states or excluding states, monitoring whether or not that's a good thing because it forces practices underground, or monitoring because it provides certain kinds of information, and whether or not you would want to use material inducements and sanctions or other ways of changing individuals' behavior. Okay, so really trying to have some kind of a normative punch and a policy punch. So what I want to now kind of get into is to actually drill down on the table and say a little bit more about the kinds of studies that Derek and I find the most interesting and helpful in this regard. So the idea is that if you see along the first row, basis of influence, what I'll do is I'm going to walk down kind of quickly. I think some of it is self-explanatory and intuitive, but also I guess some of this is on video, and I saw the Emily Hefner-Burton video, so you might not be able to see the table on the video. So I'll walk down the column. So by material inducement, I mean material interest. This is, in some sense, the idea that power, material power, defines international relationships and state behavior, that states are motivated by survival. And much of state activity and state behavior is going to be predicated on whether or not something maximizes that state's self-interest vis-a-vis the rest of the international community. The behavioral logic is instrumentalism. It's a kind of a cost-benefit calculation, and that's how you'll change actors' behavior. The forms of influence are material rewards and punishments, so we can think of this as sticks and carrots. Change the price of the behavior, and you can either increase or decrease the preferred or undesirable behavior. What is the end result? Compliance. The idea is that an actor or state actors will capitulate. Examples could include withdrawing military aid to Egypt because you disagree with the practices of the current regime. Or another example might be that's a stick. Carrot would be under the Bush administration, the Millennium account, which was a pot of money that the United States government will give to countries that show the promise to improve their human rights practices. So that's a kind of a carrot. And the thought is that that's how you'll change their behavior over time. Persuasion is modeled quite differently. You change the behavior by changing the underlying preferences and interests of the actor. The conceptual touchstone, I would say, for persuasion is the content of the norm itself. So the idea here is that you can make an appeal to an individual to change their beliefs or their practices if the merit of the idea is congruent with their existing value system. And the behavioral logic is an active assessment of the validity of the rule or the validity of the idea. In a sense, I think of this as drawing from social movements literature, which not just my sense of it. I think that's a self-understanding of some of the scholars. The techniques that advocates would use, for example, include framing, how you would frame an issue, how you would cue actors to think harder about an issue. For example, to take a domestic law example, the anti-death penalty movement within the United States didn't succeed very well by trying to claim that the death penalty was cruel. Instead, they flipped the frame to be about innocence, and the innocence project tries to demonstrate through framing around innocence and ideas that innocent people are on death row and are being executed in the United States, and that's the reason to abolish the death penalty. At the international level, Richard Price's work on landmines, he argues empirically that the ways in which the anti-landmine movement was highly successful globally was because it changed its discourse and frame around an arms control type framework into a humanitarian law type framework, that it convinced actors that their belief system was congruent with banning landmines by making certain types of arguments about the merit of the idea, such as landmines were, I think it's something like 6 times more likely to kill a civilian or a fighter after the armed conflict than to ever kill a fighter during the armed conflict. So those types of framing arguments, discursive arguments, communication that would try to reach individuals based on the merit of the idea. Thomas Rees writes an important article for the social sciences, in which the title of the article is "Let's Argue!" So the idea is that through that kind of argumentation, you can convince actors to change their beliefs, their underlying preferences, or their behavior. So the end result is not compliance, but what I call, and Derek and I call, acceptance, that the individual or the actors change their mind. Acculturation is different in character because the thought here is that the touchstone is not the content of the norm, but the relationship to the group. This draws from sociology of organization, sociological institutionalism. The thought is that the main drivers or the basis of influence are social expectations and cultural identity, that actors want to behave according to particular norms, legitimate norms of what it means to be a modern state. At least until 9/11, the idea was a modern state never tortures. The idea that a modern state today around the rest of the world, not necessarily, this hasn't had resonance in the United States, but a modern state does not have the death penalty, a modern democratic self-respecting state. That argument has gained traction. There are court cases in different countries around the world in which constitutional courts have said that they want to join the kind of like the evolution of civilization towards banning the death penalty because there's been in some ways a cascade of similar decisions around the world. So the thought is that it's about the relationship that they identify themselves with to a group. What the behavioral logic is about a conscious or unconscious assessment of an individual or an organization's social role, social status. So this means that national identity is important, national prestige is important, national honor is important, and states might behave in certain ways in order to preserve honor, to avoid national shame, to be included within a group. The forms of influence are 2 different types. Some people who have read earlier versions of this work have suggested that we should break these 2 types into additional mechanisms. But one is about social rewards and punishment. So the idea of social shaming or social backpatting. Backpatting is the device by which you would influence an actor to engage in behavioral conformity. But the other one is a cognitive identity, which is oftentimes more subconscious, that what it means to even be a state or a modern state is about identifying with a certain kind of conception. So some of the best empirical research I've seen under this banner shows the states that adopted an independent national bank. Why? Because other states had adopted an independent national bank, or they adopted a lottery system, a national lottery, because other states had adopted national lottery systems. They thought that was the way that you would develop a modern economy. Some studies have suggested that's also the case for liberalization. The thought is that it's a cognitive category, not a category that's based on social shaming and backpatting, but rather about identity formation. But it comes under the same rubric of a relationship to a group. So that's why we've put it in this column and distinguished it from persuasion and material inducement. The end result is what Derek and I describe as conformity. So often this will result, but only often, not always, as outward conformity, but private deviance. You're conforming because that's the social expectation for how you're supposed to behave, but you very well might, the actor or institutions, have private deviance in the ways in which they engage in, their true beliefs, or the ways in which they engage in behavior when nobody's looking. Okay, so for example, as a heuristic, one might think of fair trial provisions in constitutions around the world. I would suggest that those have spread as a kind of a cascade effect, that most constitutions around the world have very similar fair trial guarantees, but if you actually start to look at the trials within those countries, there's going to be a lot of deviation from the outward public conformity and the official line that those states give to the international community to belong within it. So that's what I partly mean by public conformity sometimes not matched by internal or private practices and beliefs. So that's the kind of the theoretical model. That's all I'm going to use as the purposes of PowerPoint. In some ways we could even turn off the slide, but maybe I'll just leave it up there as a reference. So the thought is that that's the kind of conceptual framework, but the argument is that there's a lot of empirical research to back this up, and that this is statistical work in many respects, but also there's some fairly good qualitative case studies. For example, of studies of why did Britain take so long to ratify the Genocide Convention, internal studies of that character. But a large part of what I want to just talk about are empirical research in the social sciences that suggests that there's the footprint of acculturation in many different policies around the world. So the idea is that these are usually large N studies of all states in which there's available information or evidence, often counted over multiple years, decades, if not some of the studies include over a 100-year period. And one of the most important findings of these studies is a demonstration of what in some sense is conformity, what I think of as twin findings. The one finding is homogenization, so ways in which states structurally start to look very similar, but there's the second finding of decoupling, that structural similarity does not match changes on the ground. So the idea is that that's somewhat hard to reconcile under certain conditions with persuasion and material inducement. We can talk about which conditions those are in which it shows evidence of acculturation and negative evidence, that's the other forms of influence. So by structural similarity, I mean standardized models or organizational goals are the same, so that states think of themselves, for example, as protectors of the natural environment, and the way in which they think of protecting the natural environment is also potentially decoupled in some of these statistical analyses from conditions on the ground. So you would predict that states would care about the natural environment if they're in fact dealing with industrialization or environmental degradation, that would be the strong predictor. But in fact, it's decoupled. That's not a very strong predictor for a lot of the structural conformity within environmental law and policy around the world. So that starts to suggest that something else is going on. And in fact, many of those findings will then find that what is a strong predictor is the greater degree to which that state is integrated into the international community. So it's actually about its relationship to international organizations that is a strong predictor of whether or not they're going to think of themselves as a protector of the environment and pass environmental impact statement laws and protect part of their biosphere with national parks and the like. So that's part of the idea behind it. The other elements that start to help us distinguish between acculturation versus persuasion and material inducement are things like this integration correlation, the idea that the greater degree to which the state is linked up into international organizations is a strong predictor or correlates with the degree to which that state is going to adopt global models or legitimated models of environmental protection, for example. And a second kind of subsidiary finding in addition to these twin findings is that normative change occurs contemporaneously across states in the world, such that you see worldwide adoption of a particular norm and it outpaces local change. So just to give an example of that, in the educational realm, there are now a lot of studies within education and educational systems and curricula around the world. And these are some of the studies that look at the national curricula of universities and schools around the world over a 100-year period in which every state that has available evidence is counted. And what the findings show is homogenization, that there's similar organizational purposes, that you would find states think that they have to, in fact, educate their public, that it's a state responsibility to do so, and both boys and girls and men and women. That their structural similarities go down to the level of having an educational ministry, standardized models of credentialing, the classrooms are similar, their school cycles are similar across the world. And then the content of the curriculum is similar, so that when the content of the curriculum shifts, it's actually shifting internationally, in which the curriculum shifts towards, for example, vocational studies or certain forms of universal human rights education rather than local studies or rather than some of the arts and science, arts and humanities. And the idea is that some of this you would expect to be patterned, or that the strong predictor would be about local conditions, not about that would be the strong predictor. What changes the curriculum? Well, local elite structure or social caste and class within the society, that you would think that would be a bottom-up pressure of social change that would then affect the curriculum. But these findings seem to suggest that, these findings suggest that what's a stronger predictor is the greater degree to which the state is integrated into the international community, and that the changes are occurring internationally according to world time, not nationally according to local time and local social pressures, okay, local social organization and the like. And that not only is that occurring, but that these are convergent shifts, so that sometimes the world curriculum, for example, shifts in one direction, then shifts in another direction, but is according to international changes, and that there's a shrinking standard deviation over time, so that you have even in terms of variation of state practices, they're starting to homogenize and look much more similar to one another over time. Another example of this is a study by George Washington professor Martha Finnemore. It's kind of an older study, but I just think that it kind of gives a sense of what Derek and I are trying to tap into, which is of national science policy boards around the world. The idea here is that states have taken on this notion that their responsibility is to promote national science, and that's more predicted by the state's integration in the international community, and is not predicted by local conditions. The idea here is that the modal category of states that adopt a national science bureaucracy board, so the states that adopt the national science bureaucracy board, the greatest are states that have less than 7 scientists in the country. So you'd think, why would you adopt a national science bureaucracy board if you only have 7 scientists? And that the other modal category for states that adopt a national science bureaucracy board are ones that spend less than 0.3% of their GDP on research and development. And what she tries to argue is that the United Nations, UNESCO went around the world telling states that to be a modern state, you have to engage in the promotion of science through this kind of bureaucratic structure. And then states built into the idea that that was legitimate as a way to conform. The last bit of this, and that is in some ways familiar territory to people who study these kinds of questions. But the last bit that I do want to then introduce, and this is where a lot of my research is now going beyond the book, is social networks. So the idea is that a large part of the studies that Derek and I used in the past to try to prove acculturation were these studies that in part come out of the Stanford School or the World Polity or World Society School that show these kinds of integration correlations and the like. But what we want to also add to that equation is social network analysis. So the idea is that you don't want to just look at the relationship between a state and the international organization that it joins, but also look at the composition of the international organization. Because if that is a cultural or social environment, you want to understand who the partners are, or who the peers are within that social environment. So the idea here is that what you want to study is social structure, and the research from are existing empirical studies that model states as nodes within a social network. And in some ways that should be almost immediately counterintuitive, because these really are the same kinds of studies that are reported on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and the like, that individuals change their behavior in terms of their eating habits according to who their friends are and their friends' eating habits, their voting behavior according to their neighborhood and who they intermix with in their employment. So the idea is that individuals' behaviors and preferences change because you rub off on who you kind of hang out with. Okay, so it's not that your preferences choose who you hang out with, but who you hang out with might actually shape your preferences. So to think that the state could be modeled in that regard is counterintuitive. The strength of some of these studies, are the ones that Derek and I are drawing on, are that these studies do actually take the state as the unit of the subject of analysis and the unit of the actor. So that some of the other studies that I've talked about for persuasion are really social psychologists, to be honest with you, studying undergraduates in their laboratories. And then us trying to extrapolate from that. These studies are much more direct in that they're actually modeling the state within a network. So what I mean by that are studies like the following. There's one recent study that suggests the greater degree to which a state has a central position within a network, the greater degree to which it's more likely to take on certain forms of diplomatic representation in international negotiations, especially in climate change. So the argument here is that when states feel as though they're in a more central position of power, they also feel that they have to behave in certain legitimate ways. And that study suggests that the states, if they're in that position within the network, are more likely to have NGOs come into their delegation. And the argument goes that that is not in the state's self-interest when you're negotiating the climate, to have NGOs within your delegation. So it's against material self-interest. It's probably against the congruence of their values, but it's more about legitimacy. And the legitimacy comes from having the pressure of being within that particular position. Another set of studies is by a scholar named Shun Kao, who studies the outcome of convergence of state capital tax rates and the outcome of convergence of states within their monetary or regulatory policies. And what he demonstrates is that there's actually a convergence or homogenization of states with respect to who they share their membership in other international governmental organizations. So he models states as being within a network. The network is identified by shared membership within other international governmental organizations. And he shows that the outcome is that states take on the behavior of what other states other states in which they share close proximate ties. Part of the neat nature of his study, and I'll talk about a couple other studies that do this, is that the organizations in which those states are members have nothing to do with monetary and fiscal policy. So the point is that they're actually meeting, discussing, debating ideas about, like one of the organizations he studies are trade organizations, but they're actually converging in other areas of their policy. So the thought is that it's about this kind of emulation effect of in some ways subconsciously taking on the behavior of your peers and other nodes within a network. Another scholar whose work we're drawing from quite heavily and I respect a great deal is Brian Greenhill, a political scientist at Dartmouth, and he studies it more within respect of the human rights. So he has demonstrated the ways in which states are members of intergovernmental organizations, and then he looks at the average human rights performance of the other states with which they share their network and demonstrates that the outcome is a convergence of human rights practices. Two things that are important about his study. First, the convergence of the practices demonstrates in many instances convergence towards worse practices. So it's not necessarily an optimistic, idealistic story that states rub off on each other's practices within the human rights realm. And second, he also, like Professor Kao, studies intergovernmental organizations that are not focused on human rights. So the idea is that this is not about persuasion, because in these organizational environments, they're not trying to argue or frame ideas around human rights, but it's rather about emulation of proximity, cultural proximity to one's peers and other states. And it's not and these are not international governmental organizations in which material rewards and punishments are being doled out according to human rights performance. So membership within other IGOs or intergovernmental organizations still having this effect and convergence of human rights practices. Other studies, just to give you a sense of them, there's a very good study by Bierce and Bondanella where they show that within dyads, states that share relationships with other states, as they look at bilateral relationships and rub off on each other, start to converge. The greater degree to which they share IGO membership with the other state in their dyad, they converge in their voting behavior at the UN, for better or for worse, for like human rights, but their voting behavior starts to shift in the same direction. And then there were a group of scientists that study this with respect to the outcome of democratization, Torferson and Ingram. They thought, and they also did it with respect to dyads, they thought that the result would be that when democratic states interface with non-democratic states, they're going to rub off on the non-democratic states. They call that mimetic isomorphism. And they find against their hypothesis that it's a two-way street. They rub off in each direction, so that the democratic states actually start to look less democratic over time if their social network is one in which they're sharing a lot of that social space with non-democratic states. And they see it in both directions. And they control for things like military power and material power. So the thought is that they're trying to isolate this as an important, not only, but an important variable. So with that in mind, the idea here is that we think we've identified an important mechanism, certainly not the only mechanism. One could even say it's maybe not the primary mechanism, but some of these studies do suggest it's the primary mechanism, acculturation or emulation or mimicry, those are other kinds of words for this, of states' behavior and practices based on their relationship to other states. And then the thought is, what's the policy payoff or a normative payoff? And the idea here is that this can translate into ways in which you would design international human rights regimes. I'll give one short example, and then I'll kind of go into an elongated example. The short example is the question of precision. A special issue of International Organization identifies precision as a hallmark of legalization. I think, if I describe this correctly, that Barbara Hermanis in your work in the rational regime design also thinks of precision as a mechanism for getting conformity among actors, because you also have, by having a precise rule, you can, incentives can be structured around that. It's also much more information can be gained when you have a greater level of precision. But certainly the legalization school of thoughts of Andy Moravcsik and Bob Cohen and Anne-Marie Slaughter have prized precision as though the more precise a norm is, the more legal it is, and then some others have suggested that's where you gain compliance. It's also in some ways an intuition of many legal scholars. So Abe Chase and Tony Chase's book suggests that the greatest reason for non-compliance of state behavior in international law is because of lack of determinism within the rules themselves. So precision is thought of even by many of the legal scholarship, as an ideal to promote compliance. Acculturation would actually suggest that precision might force disagreement, and that many of these norms are pitched at an abstract level about notions or theories of what a modern state is supposed to be, and that that's what this kind of universalizing idea of what a modern state is supposed to be, and these kinds of models are the models that have shown to have a great degree of traction and influence on state behavior. So that's the shorthand approach in some respects to ways in which we might flip an intuition that exists in the literature and commentary and policy on the idea of precision. But the second one is the idea of membership in international organizations. So this was a huge part of the former Secretary General Kofi Annan's reform of the United Nations. The question was going to become, should what used to be called the UN Commission on Human Rights place requirements on states that could participate within the organization. One year Libya had chaired the commission, another year Sudan, I believe, had gained membership on the very same year, I believe, that the United States lost its membership. So there was a groundswell of support from the U.S. State Department, the High Commission for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, to say let's place restrictions and qualifications as to who can be a member of this type of organization. And that was the model chosen, even though it's not exactly worked out that way, but it has in some respects, for the Human Rights Council, which is now the existing fairly new organization within the United Nations. So that you restrict membership. Venezuela did not get a seat because of the kinds of qualifications that are required. Other states have no hope of ever becoming members because of the qualifications that are required for membership and voting. But the thought is that was thought to be a better way of spreading influence and gaining legitimacy for the organization. Kofi Annan at the same time had a blue ribbon panel that suggested the opposite, which was universal membership. And this argument suggests that universal membership might be a better way to go if you think you want to harness acculturation, because many of the organizations that have been studied in this research suggest having a universal ideal of what it means to be a modern state, and then bringing in all comers is what actually influences those states over time to behave like what has become the legitimated model for state behavior. The other thought is that some scholars have suggested, Anne-Marie Slaughter is one of them, that the way in which you would influence a state is by banishing it, creating a badge of dishonor. So that's what exclusion, as a way of excluding states, and that's how they would bring their behavior into conformity. This argument suggests, first of all, that isn't necessarily the best track for getting states to conform. Rather, not excluding them but including them is the form of ways in which you might change state behavior and preferences. And second, also suggests that the only way in which actors would care about being banished if they initially thought of themselves as a member of the group. So the thought is that you actually want to get actors to think of themselves as a member of this particular community that they care about, and then maybe banishment or certain kinds of social sanctions might be effective. So what I thought to do is just end off by then referring back, especially for those of you who are either going to see the video or were here with Emily Hafner-Burton's presentation. So she's written this provocative book in which part of what she calls for is triage, and I kind of lump her under, for shorthand purposes, triage scholars. The idea is that she says that the international human rights machinery has not been effective in trying to bring around change of the most repressive states and the most autocratic states. And therefore, we should rededicate many of our resources towards the states in which we can actually make a difference. Okay, she's not alone. Her book, in fact, draws from not just her own scholarship and her scholarship with Keogh, but also the scholarship of one of the other most important books written on human rights in the last decade or so, Beth Simmons' book, in which Beth Simmons also ends her book with a similar kind of lesson in which she says, look, I've actually demonstrated in her book that when states ratify human rights treaties, it makes a difference on the ground and it can improve human rights practices. But that's under certain conditions. When they're transitional states that are kind of emerging into democracies or out of democracies, and there's flexibility within the system, and then it can galvanize social movements. But it does not work in her model on the other ends. For highly liberal democratic states, they've already got their rights. They're not going to change. It's not going to galvanize movements. And for highly repressive autocratic states, it's not going to galvanize people and movements because they're fearful of repressive blowback. Okay, so Emily says that Beth Simmons' book ends up agreeing with me too that you can write off the latter states, and we would be better optimizing human rights outcomes if we did so. And uses evidence that suggests, statistically speaking, when states join these organizations, they don't, autocratic states, they don't change their practices, or if you read Ona Hathaway's scholarship, their practices actually get worse after they join human rights treaties, which is a remarkable counterintuitive theory. Beth Simmons' book was written to respond to, in many respects, to Ona Hathaway's research and findings that when states join human rights treaties, their human rights practices get worse. Beth is a terrific scholar in many respects because she's very candid with her findings. Some of her findings actually support Hathaway's findings as well. So Emily Hafner-Burton brings that in as well to suggest, we've got to have a very different policy orientation to how we deal with this. So what I want to suggest is that the acculturation mechanism in the social network analysis is a corrective to triage scholarship. And what I mean by that is that first it offers an alternative theoretical explanation for the very same kinds of findings. The idea here is that when states, especially autocratic states, join international human rights treaties, we might think that they will not, in fact, change their practices if they're social network or other autocratic states. So the social network analysis would theoretically predict that would be the result. And in fact, one of Ona Hathaway's other findings is that highly repressive states are the first ones to rush to sign these agreements. So that, in fact, when the other states join, they join a social network that is already highly repressive. Okay? So the thought is that at least that's a theoretical explanation that's consistent with many of the same findings, the social network analysis. The second is that the social network analysis, with a kind of a cultural explanation for the mechanism of change, might also offer an equally plausible, if not better, explanation of backsliding. So why is it that when some states join these organizations, they do worse over time? The thought is that because if you get a liberal state, let's say, or a rights-respecting state joining these organizations, but the membership is made up of highly repressive states, you would predict some backsliding over time. So it's just like the study of democracy. Democratization starts happening in reverse. So democratic states look less democratic. And the thought is that at the very least, this is to carve out the next area of research. So that's the kind of work that needs to be done, because we need to ask the question of not just joining the organization, but who's there to greet you in a certain sense. The third point of this is to suggest that the social network analysis and the research that's being conducted does suggest that autocratic states themselves, or highly repressive states, are susceptible to these kinds of influences. So Brian Greenhill's work and the other works also suggest that states, the work on democratization, that even autocratic states become more democratic if they are in a social network or their peers are highly democratic countries. So the bottom line, I think, are twofold. So one is that you might think, if the social network analysis is correct, you would start to design international legal rules differently. For example, you might open a treaty for signature for a longer period of time so that you can encourage democratic states to join. My speculation is part of the reason democratic states don't join as quickly is because it's harder to get a democracy to buy in and a legislature to buy in to joining an international organization. It's easy for repressive states to be able to do that, autocratic states. So that might be one way in which you change the rules, or you might change the rules so that you have staggered entrance, in which you care a lot about the distribution of states or actors within the social network or within the organization, because you do think that they rub off on each other. So that's one kind of outcome of this kind of inquiry, which is to think about different legal rules and structuring international organizations differently. And then the second one is just a kind of a question that it leaves me with. And the question that it leaves me with, which I think is a really hard problem to solve, is if I follow my nose, and where my nose leads me is by the evidence, I think that a lot of the findings that Derek and I rely on in the book, and the social network analysis as well, what it suggests is you can indeed improve the practices of highly repressive states, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is that highly rights-respecting states do worse. And that's a very hard normative question to answer in terms of, do you want a human rights system that is actually able to do something about the Burmas of the world and turn them around? But it comes at the cost of other states doing worse that would otherwise have improved the civil rights and human rights protections of their own population. Thanks.